Right now, every financial news channel is tracking Brent crude. They're watching the oil price tick. They're running segments on gasoline at the pump, on tanker escorts, on OPEC's spare capacity. And they're all looking at the wrong thing. Because the Strait of Hormuz crisis isn't just an energy story. It's a food story. A 6 to 18-month slow-motion food inflation wave that is already locked in, baked into the biology of the 2026 growing season, and markets have almost no idea it's coming. Today, I'm going to walk you through the full cascade: energy to fertilizer, fertilizer to farm, farm to harvest, harvest to grocery store, and grocery store to, in the most vulnerable corners of the world, government collapse. This is the story nobody is telling. Let's get into it. When people think about the Strait of Hormuz, they think about oil, and understandably so. About 35% of global crude oil moves through that 21-mile corridor between Iran and Oman. Brent crude crossed $100 a barrel in early March for the first time in 4 years and peaked near $126. The IEA called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. But here's what the oil framing misses entirely. The Strait of Hormuz is not just an energy choke point, it is the world's fertilizer choke point. 1/3 of all globally traded fertilizer, urea, ammonia, diammonium phosphate, moves through that strait. 1/3. And since late February, shipping transits through Hormuz have collapsed by over 95%. Think about that. Not down 20%, not down 50%, down 95%. Now, some of you are already asking, why does fertilizer matter that much? Let me explain exactly why. Because this is the mechanism that connects a military conflict in the Persian Gulf to your grocery bill 6 to 9 months from now. Most people don't realize that the Persian Gulf is not just the world's gas station, it is the world's fertilizer factory. Here's why. Nitrogen fertilizers. The most important class of fertilizer for growing the grains that feed most of humanity, are made primarily from natural gas. The Haber-Bosch process, which literally feeds half the world's population, takes natural gas, strips out the hydrogen, and combines it with atmospheric nitrogen to produce ammonia. Ammonia is the foundation of almost every nitrogen fertilizer. Urea, ammonium nitrate, UAN solution. The Gulf states have absurdly cheap, abundant natural gas. Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they've spent decades building out world-scale ammonia and urea production facilities, precisely because they have the cheapest feedstock on the planet. The result? The Persian Gulf now accounts for nearly half of all global urea exports. 46% of the world's most widely used nitrogen fertilizer originates from this region. India gets 18% of its urea from the Gulf. Brazil, the world's largest soy exporter, gets 10%, China 8%, and across East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia, entire agricultural systems are built around the assumption that Gulf fertilizer will flow reliably and cheaply every single year. That assumption broke on February 28, 2026. When Hormuz effectively closed, fertilizer markets moved immediately. And they moved hard. Within the first 3 weeks, urea prices were already up 28%. By late March, urea had surged 50% from pre-conflict levels. DAP and MAP, the phosphate fertilizers critical for root development and grain fill, crossed $700 per metric ton. UAN solution, the liquid nitrogen product that Midwest corn farmers rely on for side dress applications, surpassed $400 per metric ton. For context on how extreme this is, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, fertilizer prices spiked dramatically, but it took months to unfold. The Hormuz closure produced a comparable nitrogen fertilizer response in weeks because the Gulf is so specifically concentrated in urea and ammonia production. Now here's something critical that most people overlook. Fertilizer prices aren't like oil prices. When oil prices spike, you feel it at the pump within days. When fertilizer prices spike, the transmission into food prices takes 2 growing seasons, 6 months at the minimum, 18 months for the full effect to play out. That lag is the invisible timer that is running right now. And most investors, most consumers, and most policymakers are not watching it. To understand why timing is so critical, you need to understand a little plant biology. Corn. And I'm going to focus on corn because it's the linchpin of the American food system and one of the most fertilizer-intensive crops on Earth. Corn absorbs the vast majority of its nitrogen needs in a very specific window. The first 30 to 45 days of growth, from germination through the V6 stage, is when the plant sets the foundation for its entire yield potential. Nitrogen applied late, or at reduced rates, during this window cannot be compensated for later. Reducing nitrogen application by just 10 to 15%, or delaying application by 2 to 4 weeks, can reduce corn yields by 10 to 25%. Read that again, 10 to 15% less fertilizer, 10 to 25% less corn. And here's what's happening on the ground right now. As of mid-March, the U.S. fertilizer supply was running at about 75% of normal levels. That's the opening of the spring planting window, the moment when Corn Belt farmers typically start their first fertilizer applications. With urea prices up 50% and availability uncertain, farmers are facing a decision tree with no good options. Option 1. Pay the higher price, maintain full application rates, absorb the margin hit, and hope corn prices recover enough to cover it. The USDA's projected corn price for 2026 is $4.20 a bushel, below the national break-even for most producers. Option 2. Reduce fertilizer application rates, lock in lower yields, reduce your losses per acre at the cost of total production volume. Option 3. Switch to soybeans. Soybeans fix their own nitrogen through root bacteria. They need far less synthetic fertilizer. Many farmers are making this switch right now, which means corn acreage is going down, and corn supply is going with it. Surveys of Corn Belt farmers show something even more alarming. For every farmer worried about fertilizer for the 2026 season, there are nearly 2 worried about 2027. Because if the Hormuz situation persists, or even partially recovers, the structural uncertainty means farmers can't plan, can't lock in contracts, can't forward price their inputs. The 2027 planting decisions, made this fall, are already being infected by the uncertainty. Now, let's talk about what this means for food prices, because this is where it gets very direct, very personal, and very unavoidable. The USDA's current food price outlook already projects overall food inflation at 3.6% in 2026. That's before the fertilizer shock fully transmits. That's before reduced yields hit the supply side. That's before livestock producers start liquidating herds because corn feed costs are underwater. Wolf Research has estimated the fertilizer disruption alone could add roughly 2 additional percentage points to food-at-home inflation in the U.S. That would put grocery inflation in the 5% to 6% range. On top of everything else, consumers are already absorbing from tariffs and energy costs. But the corn-to-food transmission is the one that really hits home for American consumers, because corn is everywhere. Corn is the feed grain for beef cattle, dairy cows, pigs, and poultry. When corn gets more expensive, every animal protein gets more expensive. Beef is already running 14% higher year over year. USDA expects another 10% increase in 2026 as the cattle herd continues its multi-year contraction. Poultry is climbing. Dairy is under margin pressure. And then there's corn itself in processed food. High fructose corn syrup, cornstarch, corn oil, ethanol that blends into your gasoline. corn is embedded in thousands of products that never look like corn on a grocery shelf. The inflationary impulse doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in layers. The first layer, fuel and fertilizer price spikes, is happening now. The second layer, spring planting shortfalls translating to reduced grain supply, hits in Q3 and Q4 of this year. The third layer, the full pass-through of lower yields and higher input costs into retail food prices, peaks in the first half of 2027. Helios AI, which models agricultural risk across 77 commodities in 90 countries, is projecting global food prices to rise 12 to 18% by end of 2026, with the peak pressure arriving in the first half of next year. Now I want to step back from US grocery bills for a moment, because while higher food prices are painful for American consumers, they are survivable. For much of the world, what's coming isn't painful. It's catastrophic. Before the Hormuz crisis began, 318 million people were already facing crisis-level hunger across 68 countries. That's more than double the 2019 figure. The WFP ran the scenario analysis in March. Their conclusion: if the conflict persists past mid-2026 and oil stays above $100 per barrel, 45 million additional people fall into acute food insecurity. This would put global hunger at levels not seen since the start of the Ukraine war, but the mechanism is more severe because this time it's not a breadbasket region that's been disrupted. It's an input region. The Hormuz closure simultaneously raises oil prices, natural gas prices, fertilizer prices, shipping costs, and food prices, all at once, through a single choke point. Let me give you the geography of this. India imports 18% of its urea from the Gulf, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. These are densely populated countries with thin agricultural margins, where fertilizer is the difference between self-sufficiency and import dependency. East and Southern Africa, Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, Tanzania, Mozambique, collectively face 17.7 million additional people crossing the hunger threshold under the WFP scenario. Sudan imports 80% of its wheat. Somalia has seen essential commodity prices rise at least 20% since February alone. Neither country has meaningful fiscal reserves, neither can subsidize food prices, and humanitarian aid funding has already dropped 40% globally between 2024 and 2025. The safety net that was supposed to catch these populations is itself fraying. Here is where this becomes a geopolitical story, not just a humanitarian one. In 2010 and 2011, a 40% spike in global food prices, driven by Russian wheat export bans and drought, helped topple 4 governments across the Middle East and North Africa: Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen. The Arab Spring, which restructured the geopolitics of an entire region, was catalyzed in significant part by the fact that food became unaffordable for urban populations already living on the margin. The 2026 crisis is larger in scale, broader in geography, and hitting governments with far less fiscal capacity than those that fell in 2011. The IMF's data point here is chilling. In low-income countries, food accounts for approximately 36% of total household spending. Compare that to 20% in emerging markets and 9% in wealthy nations. When more than a third of your household income goes to eating, and food prices spike 20%, you have nothing left to absorb it. And your government knows it. Political pressure from food inflation is existential for governments that can't subsidize, can't borrow, and can't produce their way out. The countries at highest risk, Sudan, South Sudan, Yemen, Mali, Haiti, Somalia, are the same countries already on the FAO and WFP's highest concern list before this crisis began. They are being hit by the fertilizer shock on top of pre-existing fragility. Financial markets have priced the oil shock. They have not priced the food to instability chain that follows it by 3 to 6 months. Let me bring this back to the investment landscape. The thesis here is that a significant food inflation wave, one that markets have not yet fully priced, is locked into the next 6 to 18 months. The biological and seasonal mechanisms that create this lag are not visible in oil price charts or CPI readings today, but they are running. What does that mean practically? First, grain and soft commodity futures. Corn, wheat, and soy are the direct expression of the supply reduction that's unfolding. Watch basis levels in the Corn Belt, the spread between futures and local cash prices, as a real-time indicator of actual physical tightness. Second, agricultural input companies. Fertilizer producers outside the Gulf, CF Industries, Mosaic, Nutrien, are direct beneficiaries of price dislocation. Their margins expand when Gulf supply is constrained and global urea prices spike. This is already showing up. Third, food companies with thin margin structures. FMCG companies that can't easily pass through input cost increases are facing significant margin compression in the second half of 2026 and into 2027. Supply chain analysts are calling this a 6 to 9 month lag that most corporate risk management teams haven't modeled yet. Fourth, and this is the macro angle I find most interesting. If food inflation adds 2 percentage points to core PCE at a moment when the Fed is already caught between a slowing labor market and tariff-driven price pressure, you have the conditions for a more prolonged stagflationary environment than consensus currently expects. And for those of you who hold physical precious metals, which have historically been strong performers in stagflationary periods, the silver angle is particularly worth watching. The Hormuz crisis has constrained sulfur supply, which comes as a byproduct of Gulf oil and gas refining. Sulfur is a key input for phosphate fertilizer processing. And silver supply, which comes largely as a byproduct of copper and zinc mining, is also in a multi-year structural deficit. These are interconnected constraint stories across the commodity complex, not isolated shocks. I want to close with the thing that worries me most, because it gets the least attention. The 2026 growing season is compromised. Less fertilizer, crop switches, and some acres left unplanted. The 2026 harvest will be smaller. But 2027 is where the feedback loop becomes dangerous. Decisions made now, fall planting, fertilizer contracts, acreage, are being made under maximum uncertainty. NCGA surveys show that for every farmer worried about 2026, 2 are worried about 2027. EU analysts warn a sharp drop in fall-planted grain area can't be ruled out. If it isn't planted this fall, the 2027 wheat and barley crop won't exist. Even if Hormuz reopened tomorrow, restarting fertilizer production and transport takes weeks the Northern Hemisphere doesn't have. The biological clock won't wait for diplomacy. The market is watching oil. The food cascade is in motion. 2027 is being written now, one unplanted acre at a time. That's the story the financial press is missing, and the one you need to watch. If this breakdown was useful, please share it. The more people understand how these macro shocks transmit into everyday life, the better the decisions, at work and at home. Subscribe for more deep macro analysis, and I'll see you in the next one.